Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Wow, it's overwhelmingly amazing to be with you in the room. This is my first in-person presentation in a very long time, so I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much for having me. As mentioned, my name is Ashley Fell. I'm the Director of Advisory at an organisation called McCrindle. We are a research-based advisory insights organisation, so every day we're conducting a lot of research, we're looking at a lot of numbers, and oftentimes we are introduced or we're described as social researchers or futurists because we study human behaviour, and it is an absolutely fascinating job every day to look at lots of different data sets. But really what I think better sums up our team, and I have cleared with them that it's okay for me to show this next slide, is this one. This better describes who we are, and basically just poring over Excel spreadsheets every day, looking at the data, looking at the trends, drawing out the insights, and then my role is, I guess, getting to come to conferences like this and Zoom boardrooms and to describe and, I guess, explain the trends, how society is changing. And I guess for us at McCrindle, there's no bigger event in our calendar than the census. Now, I'm not sure if you remember filling out the census last year. This year we're going to receive those results, and we are so excited. And I think very fittingly, being here in Sydney Olympic Park, this next sort of memory from the recent Olympics really sums up us when the census data comes out. We're just very excited. You know, it's an exciting life we lead as demographers. But I really loved everything I've heard today so far, especially around the idea that our world is changing, I guess because I've got the data and the facts to back that up. But even prior to 2020, our world was changing. And one really interesting exercise to look at is to look at the Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year that they deem to describe the year that was. And just in one word or a series of words, we can see how society has been changing even prior to this transformative 2 years with the pandemic. So in 2011, the word of the year was deemed to be app. In 2012, it was cloud. In 2013, it wasn't even a word, but it was a symbol, specifically the hashtag. Remember when we were all tweeting all of our thoughts? And Twitter's had a resurgence, which is great to see. In 2014, the word of the year was selfie. In 2015, again, iconically, it wasn't even a word, but an emoji, specifically the face with tears of joy. Now, I'm going to talk a fair bit about Gen Z today, and I have on good authority that if you want to be cool, don't use this emoji anymore. Apparently, it's gone out of fashion. I feel like I can just see a few heads nodding, so I'm not the only one who's heard that. In 2016, the word of the year was post-truth. So I feel like 2016 was a pretty significant shift to a dialogue and a context that really shaped the next few years. In 2017, it was fake news. In 2018, it was toxic, not just to describe the toxic impacts on our environment and an increase in focus on sustainability, but we had the Me Too movement, so sort of toxic describing that toxic masculinity that society was pushing back on. In 2019, the word of the year was climate emergency, so 2 words. And in 2020, I wonder what you think the word of the year was. 2020, a pretty iconic year. I just heard COVID there. Well, it was so iconic and so much happened in this year that the Oxford English Dictionaries couldn't pick just one word. They chose multiple words, and that's not even all of them. That's how massive that year was, and it was bigger than just COVID. We had the bushfires early in 2020 in Australia and in California as well. We had Black Lives Matter, we had cancel culture. So a transformative year in many ways, and in 2021, the word of the year was actually vax, V-A-X. Again, to describe, I guess, our path in some ways out of COVID-19. And I guess all of this is hopefully a bit of a fun and engaging way to paint this picture that we are living in times of great change. And if you're sitting here, especially after the last 2 years, feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the amount of change, I just want to assure you that you are not alone. As social researchers, we've observed through our surveys and our focus groups that many people are feeling what we call change fatigue, whereby you might acknowledge that the world is changing very rapidly, but you're just a bit fatigued by the amount of it. Kind of like this grandmother here who had her Gen Z grandchildren help her with the problem of too many buttons on the remote control. Now, I commend the innovation. Displayed here, but this is one response we believe that leaders in ministry, in organisations, in society, in business can't have. We can't have that sort of makeshift solution. The second common response that we see to change is what we call change apathy. whereby, again, you might acknowledge that the world's rapidly changing, but you're just a bit apathetic about the need to always be responding. Kind of like this line writer here who saw something happening in her external environment and just thought, no thanks, I'll just continue doing things the way I always have. But I guess the last 2 years has really highlighted that we can't have these responses, and we will be moved towards the edges if we do have these responses. But I did just want to acknowledge that it has been a tough couple of years for many people, and I definitely identified with this tweet from Simon, who said, don't know about y'all, but I could really go for some precedented times, because it has been a time of rapid change, and it has been unprecedented, and many of us, especially those of us involved in ministry and leading churches, have had to work out how we do ministry, how we pastor people when you can't see them face to face, when you can't look into their eyes, when you can't hear them except from on a screen, and even with our families and being connected. And it certainly feels like for us, and in our research that I'm going to draw upon today, that we're living in a pretty significant cultural moment. Now, during 2020 and even 2021 at McCrindle, we conducted more research than ever before because we wanted to find out what these massive transformative societal changes were, what sort of impact they were having on the everyday Australian experience. And this was one of our first studies, the results from one of our first studies in 2020 about the top emotions people are experiencing. So you can see here, and probably not surprised, that the sentiment was that people were feeling anxious and frustrated and vulnerable and scared. And 27% though were feeling hopeful. We reran these questions and this particular question later on in the year, and we actually found that that shift had occurred where hope had started to come through, and as we got a bit of a hook, I guess, or an understanding of the pandemic and how to respond to it. But really interestingly, what we found was when we asked Australians, what's the biggest negative impact of the pandemic? What's it been on you? This was in 2020 when we didn't really have many cases of the virus. People weren't getting sick. There were physical impacts. It was also about our mental health, but especially the social impact, where we were missing seeing our family and friends. And for those of us who go to church, we were missing seeing our brothers and sisters in Christ. And of course, the church is a huge social connection point of purpose for so many people, and to not be able to meet in the room together had some significant impacts on Australians and Australian Christians. Another study I just want to talk about a little bit this morning before I get into some of the Gen Z characteristics, to just paint the context of this changing world that we're operating in, this changing city of Sydney, is that we conducted a big study last year called The Future of the Church. And what we based that research on was 30 in-depth interviews with Australian senior pastors across different denominations to paint and to understand their picture, as well as some other stats around the general population around Christianity. So some of the interesting findings that we came across was that Australians are disillusioned with the church, but they're spiritually hungry. So we know from our research that, and you've probably seen it from the census data, that the proportion of Australians identifying with Christianity has been declining. However, that doesn't just paint the whole story. The media tends to draw on that. Christianity is dead in Australia. That is not true. People are spiritually hungry. And why are they disillusioned? Well, our research found that one of the main reasons is that church culture has become detached from the everyday Australian experience. So there's a disconnect there. Another reason that people told us they were disillusioned or not willing to engage with the church was that they could list some poor examples of leadership from the church. And so these are just, I think, helpful things to get into the minds of those maybe who might be a little bit warm to Christianity but aren't stepping into our church buildings or joining our church services on Zoom in this current context. Now, as I mentioned, we know that Christian identity in Australia has been declining. You can see here over the last few years from the census results, and we'll get those next census results later on this year, so we'll be able to update this information. But we can see here the proportion of Australians identifying with Christianity is on the decline. We don't want to sort of just skim over that reality. But we can also see that the proportion of the Christian population who attend church regularly is staying fairly consistent. So again, there's more to the picture than just that declining proportion of Australians who are identifying with Christianity. Another really, I think, encouraging statistic is that almost 7 in 10 Australians have a spiritual perspective. So just because people in Australia aren't ticking a certain box in the census for which religion they identify with, we've conducted other nationally representative surveys which say there is a large proportion who believe in some spiritual element, which indicates they're open to spirituality and to exploring and to having conversations about the meaning of life and those sorts of things that hopefully can open the door for us to sharing the gospel with them. Another truth that we found from our research, and I'm sure many of you as pastors and leaders would feel this, but we've got the data now to back it up, is that times of hardship cause us to think about what really matters to us. So we found that during the experience of COVID-19, 47% of Australians, so not just Christians, of all Australians, have thought more about their mortality. Another 47% have thought about the meaning of life more. And 28% have actually been praying more. So in those times where we didn't know what was happening, where we had to maybe be scared of other people, remember those times we would hear Gladys's updates, treat everyone you know that you meet like they have COVID. So different to how we want to engage in community with other people. We had to go through all of that as a nation, as a society, and that's caused people to reflect on deeper and spiritual aspects. I found this also really encouraging. We asked about whether people are open to a spiritual conversation. And we found that actually there was 38% who said they were extremely or very open. So that's almost 2 in 5 Australians who say, I'm very open to talking about spirituality. I think the message that we often get fed by the media is that, again, Christianity is not alive. People are not interested in engaging, but they are. Our research has found a further 41% said they're somewhat slightly open, and 21% said, no, I don't want to have those conversations. So I think, again, important for us to understand, and interestingly, it's actually the younger generations who are more spiritually open. We found that 38% of all Australians said they were extremely or very open to having spiritual conversations, but that proportion increases to 44% for Generation Y, who are the millennials, who are in their sort of late 20s and 30s, and 50% for Gen Z, who are in their largely sort of mid to late teens and in their 20s. So the conversation, we believe, is a lot more complex and nuanced than maybe just what we hear sometimes from certain media, particularly popular media. Our research from these interviews with church pastors and leaders is that the call is to rise, not retreat. The call is to respond to these changing times rather than feel like Christianity is being pushed to the margins of society. Another shift that we saw in the pandemic is that there is also a return to local happening. There's been a lot of population mobility as a result of COVID in this work from home environment. We found 60% of Australians who don't live in a regional area said they would consider moving to one. So we've got lifestyle, employability, all these aspects now coming together where we've got the rise of the regions, but also the rise of the local community. When we couldn't leave our 5-kilometre radius, we got to know all the cafes and all the people in our community when that happened to us. And what we're seeing is this return to local, where people are valuing shopping locally, their walkable community, and their strong local community. And we know, and I'm sure you know as well anecdotally, that the church plays a hugely important role in every local community. There is a powerhouse, important building there where God's people gather and God's people care for those in their community. We also know from our research and from even what has been shared from the platform today that COVID-19 has extended us many digital opportunities to continue to meet and learn together even when we've been locked down or isolated. And perhaps a few of us had to take that a bit humbly. I did see this meme about pastors and doing services online, prior to 2020, back in 2010. We were maybe thinking, nope, and now it's the most amazing opportunity for us to connect. And so it is a changing context, and if you are one of these, absolutely no shame. But it is an important shift that's taking place to our sort of online worlds of ways of working, ways of connecting, ways of doing church. And we believe that we are living in a time of massive transformation where, we've got technology, which is an enabler, and we've had COVID-19, which has been the catalyst that's forced this rapid transformation that may have taken, 5 to 10 years normally, and it was fast-tracked into 1 or 2. So the question that many pastors that we spoke to in our research actually was sort of raising with us was, is this the greatest evangelistic opportunity of our lifetime? And it was quite an interesting challenge to think about. One of the pastors that we interviewed was Nicky Gumbel, and he said, I was very against doing services online because I thought they would attract people from other churches. But people who would never go to church are coming to our services. Watching online is like Zacchaeus. It allows people to see Jesus without Jesus seeing them. And me personally, my own story is that I grew up in a non-Christian family, never really attended church, was a little bit intimidated by that, and then through a Christian high school and the local youth group, I was able to come to know Jesus. But if maybe you remember when you were exploring, it can be intimidating. It can be a little bit scary. These are deep questions about our souls and our faith in the future and eternity that we're asking people to explore. And so maybe people who are curious but who are too scared to step into a church building can view online. So there are certainly some amazing opportunities. Phil Pringle, another pastor we interviewed, shared this quote in our research. He said, there's a magic in meeting together that can't be replaced, but there are opportunities online that can't be duplicated too. People who can't come to church, people who don't want to walk into a big building can still engage with our church services online. So we don't want to discount, and none of the pastors we interviewed discounted the value in meeting together face to face, in hearing each other sing. Even this morning, such a blessing to worship together and be here and speak to each other and look into each other's eyes, not through a screen. But the digital and the online world does create opportunities. So hopefully that paints you a little bit of a picture of our changing world. I want to shift a little bit now to thinking about the emerging generations within this context that I've just painted. If we think about engaging the emerging generations. Now, if you don't know which generation you sit in, I thought I'd just helpfully paint a quick picture of the 6 generations we have in our world today. So at our oldest end, we've got our builders generation, age 77 and over, followed by our baby boomers, age between 58 and 76. Our Gen Xers are today aged between 43 and 57. Then we've got our Gen Ys who are 28 to 42. Sometimes they're called the millennials. That's often a synonym for Generation Y. Then we've got our Gen Zs who are aged between 13 and 27. And following them, we've got our youngest generation, our Generation Alphas. We have a pretty big interest in Generation Alpha because Mark McCrindle, our founder and principal, was actually credited with giving them their name. And a lot of people, when he was conducting research for a book he wrote about it over a decade ago, he realized that nobody was thinking about what label would be used to come after Z. So he conducted a survey of Australians and he said, what do you think the next generation should be called? And a lot of people said, Generation Technology or Generation Glass, because technology is going to be so transformative for them. Some people said Generation A because we've come to the end of the alphabet with Gen Z. But Mark thought, let's move to the Greek alphabet to signify this whole new world in which Generation Alpha will be shaped. So they're the generation born since 2010. That was the same year the first iPad was released. So they will only ever know a world of iPads. And I don't parent any Generation Alphas yet, but I'm a proud auntie to 6 of them. I was babysitting my niece Chloe recently, and she just got up from the couch, waddled up to the TV, and just expected it to be a touch screen because that's the world that she's engaging in and the platform that she's learning on. So it's certainly a different world. But a lot of the focus today, and rightly so, is on Generation Z. Because they're our high school students, they're our university students, our TAFE students, they're the emerging workforce, the emerging generation of leaders that we're starting to see come through. And they're a fascinating generation to observe. Even today, if we think about the workforce, this is the current composition of the workforce by generation. But by 2030, which is not that far away, Generation Z will comprise 1/3 of the workforce. And over the next 8 years, that proportion from 14% today will get obviously increasingly bigger. Now, we conducted a big study last year just of Generation Z, and I think it's helpful to think about their psyche and their perspective if we're hoping to engage with them and attract them to our churches. So we know the top hopes for Generation Z are owning their own home, so that great Australian dream still alive and well, followed by having full financial freedom and independence. They want to excel in their career, travel and see the world, and pursue interests and hobbies. So quite a driven generation. We also looked at the inverse of that, their top 5 fears. And number 1 was not having enough money to live comfortably, probably looking at the Gen Ys above them who've been reprimanded for their love of smashed avo and being locked out of the housing market. So that may be playing into their response here. Number 2, being stuck in a job they don't enjoy or find fulfillment in. So we know they're quite purpose and values driven, especially when it comes to their work. They're scared of not reaching their full potential, they're scared of not finding love, and never being able to buy their own home, which in the current Australian market is a pretty valid fear, I think. And so, especially in Sydney. So we can see these top 5 hopes and fears, I think, are just helpful for us to get into the mindset of Generation Z. Another helpful aspect I've found when I've engaged with leaders, maybe who are a little bit apprehensive of the next generation coming through because they are so different, is to acknowledge that we are talking about a generation who do speak a different language. We call it slanguage. That idea that they're bringing text and slang speak into the workplace, into church services, and it's pretty funny at times. And so I thought what I would do, just to upskill and equip us all, is show you a bit of a phrase that you might hear from a young Gen Z. And I think together we can decrypt what they're trying to say. So something you might hear is, "Bae, my new work gig is legit. The hours are savage. YOLO." Now, let's just decrypt what this person's talking about. So BAE is actually an acronym, and it stands for Before Anyone Else. I don't feel like many Gen Zs even know that themselves, though, to be honest. My new work gig, they're talking about their new job. It's legit, it's legitimate. It's happening now. The hours are savage, so maybe the hours are pretty intense. And then YOLO stands for You Only Live Once, which reminds me of an acronym that we often use to talk about Gen Z and their social media behaviour, which is FOMO, in that social media environment, fear of missing out. And that reminds me of sort of the adult version I've heard, which I quite appreciate, which is JOMO, the joy of missing out. When you don't fear it anymore, you don't mind having a night in, although maybe after COVID, that's a bit outdated now. Too much time at home in the last 2 years. But you can see someone is responding. So something you might hear in response is, "Yas queen, slay girl, goat." Now again, let's just decrypt this. So yas queen, for real female empowerment, just queen, someone at the top of their game. Slay, it's to kill it, but it's positive. And then GOAT stands for? Greatest of all time. Often used in a sporting context, but Gen Z can apply it anywhere. Now, sometimes Gen Z, I will admit, they do take a while to get to the point, because all this conversation really entails is, I like my job. Great. But nonetheless, I think it's important that we do take a moment to just acknowledge they've grown up in a different time, they've grown up in a different context, they're using different language to communicate their excitement and their fears and what's going on in their life. And we know that there are some key defining characteristics that it's important we understand about this generation. The first is, of course, that they're digital. They're digital integrators who have grown up with technology and social media pretty seamlessly integrated into most aspects of their life from quite a young age. Now, all of us are living in what we call the Great Screen Age, but Generation Z have been shaped in the Great Screen Age, whereby many of us are multi-screening. And again, COVID-19 just accelerating this aspect where we're multi-screening and engaging with multiple pieces of information and entertainment at the same time. 95% of Generation Z own a smartphone, and 74% of Generation Z's time, on average, is spent online outside of school or work. So we know that they're a very digital generation, and as I mentioned before, the generation coming through under them will be even more so, and you can see here this little Gen Alpha just expecting this magazine to be a touch screen, so a little bit of the sign of things to come for this next generation. But it's also fascinating and maybe a little bit scary to think about some of the outgoing technology for the emerging generations. It's very likely that Generation Z will never actually use a fax machine, a landline phone, or a traditional GPS system. It's also likely, because of our contactless and digital payments, they may never actually own a credit card, therefore may never need to carry a wallet or own an analog watch. So again, things that we're like, yeah, of course these aspects will continue. This is what we had when we were growing up or been in our 20s, that those times are changing. And again, that societal change that I mentioned earlier, that the catalyst and the enabler has certainly created an accelerated transformative time that we're all living in, but again, that Generation Z particularly are being shaped in. So digital are these emerging generations that I think it's also changed what we fear in life. If you'd asked an Australian 2 decades ago, what are your 3 biggest fears? You might have said something like snakes, spiders, and heights. I think today we don't fear these things anymore as much as we fear symbols. One of the biggest fears, I would say, is of this symbol here. When you can't connect to the world around you. And again, COVID, accelerating this. We can't connect to our church service. The streaming's not working. We're out of Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi symbols low. This is a cause of great concern. But what's maybe even scarier is this one, when you've got to wait for something to load. Will it even load? If you've got a Mac, it's the wheel of death, where you think, has everything I've worked on this laptop being lost? A grave cause for grave concern. You can see here there's room for one more. You may know where this is going. The scariest symbol of them all would have to be this one. The low battery, whereby all forms of connectivity cease to exist. And I'm sure there's a breadth of generations in this room, and I hear and I see, which is so lovely, by the way, just to be in the room with you again, to hear your response. And I think it's not just Gen Z who fear these things, is it? It's all of us now. Again, very much heightened through the COVID experience. So the first characteristic is that they're digital. The second characteristic is that Generation Z are a globally connected generation. Let me just depict to you visually what this global digital world looks like. This top image here was taken in the year 2005. It was taken outside the historic location of the Sistine Chapel, and it's people gathering for the inauguration of Pope Benedict. Fast forward 8 years later, how different do you think this image would look when people are gathering for the inauguration of Pope Francis? Quite different, and 2013 was almost a decade ago now. Just realised this balloon was here. Hopefully it hasn't been there like the whole time. Thank you. You're laughing at that, not my jokes. So 2013, very different world. And of course, the pandemic, again, we just can't ignore how much that has changed our world and Gen Z's perspective. This study found that 74% of Generation Z said they agree the pandemic has highlighted new issues for them and made them more sympathetic towards the needs of different people around the world. So maybe one tiny silver lining there of the challenges the last couple of years has presented us. So we're talking about a generation who's digital, who's global. The third characteristic is that they're a very mobile generation. We expect them to move across more jobs and careers than any other generation previously. If you think about your career trajectory, you might have gone from school into work and then into further study, quite linear. The career trajectory of a young person today looks a little bit more like this. There's more options available to them than ever before, which is very exciting, but can be quite daunting when you're asking, what do you want to do with your life for the rest of your life? It is likely they will have many jobs. And our research actually predicts a school leaver today, a Generation Z, will have 18 jobs across 6 careers on average, because the average tenure is now down to about 2 years and 9 months, and we're living longer, and so we're going to need to work later in our life. So that means there's just heaps more career and job mobility. The only thing it seems, though, that Generation Z aren't moving more frequently is out of the family home. Now, if anyone here parents any Generation Zs, you may know this truth, this deep truth that they are staying at home later. There's a few reasons for that in their defense. More are going to university, they're coming out of their education with a big debt, they're delaying getting married, having children, those life markers that tend to happen earlier for previous generations. And that is why oftentimes they're also labelled a generation of kippers. And if you haven't come across that term, what it stands for is kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. So my condolences if anyone here identifies with that, maybe a little bit more than others do. So they're very mobile. They're also a very visual generation. This is the generation who've grown up with social media where information and stats and statistics are the same thing, facts and stories are very condensed. They've got shorter attention spans, as I think, to be honest, we all do. We expect information to be communicated concisely and quickly and visually. We say the number one search engine for these emerging generations is no longer Google, it's actually YouTube, because why would they read something when they can watch it? So a shift in how they engage. Does that mean we value reading less? I personally think no. I think we should educate. As someone who's written a book or 2 books, I would love people to continue reading. And I think as Christians, we want to encourage that depth of exploration and critical thinking that does come when you invest time into something. But I think we also need to acknowledge the change that's happening. And so much so that I have seen some responses to change along this line. If you haven't heard this one, TLDR, too long, didn't read. So we don't want that response, do we? We don't want that response to the information that we're putting out. So we need to work harder as communicators when we want to have a message that gets cut through. The fifth and final characteristic is that Generation Z are a very social generation. Of course, by the fact that they've grown up with social media at their fingertips, they're used to engaging with the connections and opinions of their peers and influencers. They're very social, and by life stage, they're very social. They're in their teens and early 20s. It is a very social life stage. And even we found actually it was the youngest generation and the oldest generation who said in that research I shared earlier that they had the biggest negative impact from COVID was on their social health. It was the youngest and the oldest. In those life stages where you're not having a family or you've passed that, you really do rely on social connections for your mental and emotional well-being. So we're seeing that with this generation. So social are they, though, that signs like this need to be installed in buildings like this one. In case of fire, exit building before Instagramming about it. So bit of I guess, wisdom that we may need to impart among the emerging generations, acknowledging they are a very social generation. So I wanted to hopefully, the part one of my presentation today was about painting for you the changing context from some of our research as to how society and Sydney and Australians are changing in response to the pandemic. But then part two was to describe to you some of the changing characteristics that we're seeing in the emerging generations that it's helpful, we believe, to be aware of as you seek to engage and communicate with the next generation. And one other area I just wanted to touch on is in our research in the Future of the Church report, we were asking these leaders about the key challenges they see in developing the leadership pipeline within churches among the next generation. The first challenge they saw was that the range of career options for young people today is greater than ever. As I shared, they're very mobile, so there's more options available to them. So if we're thinking about attracting and retaining not just Gen Z church members, but people who want to move into a life of ministry among this next generation, that's a challenge. Another challenge these church leaders saw was the loss of respect for clergy as a profession. That parental pressure to go into a career that pays well can impact a student's perspective today in terms of what path they choose. And also that the lack of clear structures and systems for developing leaders can also be a challenge if Generation Z maybe have the desire or the calling to move into a life of ministry, but they don't feel like there's structures in place to support them in that. They may choose not to do that or go somewhere else. So hopefully that's a bit of helpful perspective. And I just wanted to end my presentation on three really quick where to from here tips as to how do we respond to all this information as leaders. I think the first tip is, and this is from our research, is to rewrite your internal narrative, to share maybe some of these statistics with your church members and say it's not as dire as sometimes the popular media paints the picture as Christians. People are open, people are spiritually searching, and that provides a huge opportunity for us as Christians evangelistically to go there and to meet people where they're at and to share the good news and the gospel. Number two, it's to reach out relationally. I think we're going to see in 2022 a bit of hesitancy as people emerge from elongated periods of lockdown. We've lost our relational fitness in some ways, but we know that people are searching for relationships, that we haven't had that over the last couple of years, that Generation Z, a very social generation, are looking for that. So if church can be a place for that, that can be a great aspect. And I heard a great quote from Ruth Powell from the National Church Life Survey who said, belonging comes before belief in many cases. That people, and that's been personally the case for me when I was attending youth group as a non-Christian, I was there for the community, and when I was in that place, the Holy Spirit was working in me. And so maybe it wasn't the reason I was there when I was 13 years old, going to Crossfire, the youth group in my local area, but it was an important aspect and a journey for me to get there. And the third, of course, to talk about Gen Z is to raise up the next generation of leaders. We know that this generation are searching for things, and we know that the future of the church relies on a strong pipeline of leaders that can be diverse and well-rounded. And we want to acknowledge that in Australia, there are some challenges with the declining proportion of Australians identifying with Christianity, but people are open, and if we can reach out to those next generation and equip them and encourage them in their ministry roles, I think the future of the church is going to be in a great place as we seek to continue to share the way, the truth, and the life of Jesus with those in our communities, not of all generations, but of course of the emerging generation as well. So thank you very much for your time today. I referenced a lot from our Future of the Church report there, and I know what everyone I know you know what a QR code is now. We're actually using QR codes before COVID, and I was like explaining to people, take your phone out and line it up. Now we all know what to do. So if you're interested in getting a free copy of that report, you can just take a photo of that QR code and you can delve deeper into some of the insights I shared today. But thank you very much for your time. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight. Thank you.